Recent HMRC data on inheritance tax tells us that London and the South East contributed 49% of the inheritance tax collected in 2013-14. The majority of that inheritance tax was generated by residential property and investments. The proportion of estates subject to inheritance tax overall in the UK in that year was only 8%. So only 8% of estates in 2013 and 14 bore inheritance tax. Now, the reality for investment advisors is that the proportion of their clients whose estates will be subject to inheritance tax will be almost inevitably much greater than 8%, because they'll be targeting the higher net worth as people who can effectively afford to pay for advice, however they pay for it. Now, the majority of that inheritance tax yield, as I said, came from investments and residential property. And so what can we take from this? Whilst the tax itself doesn't represent a huge part of the overall tax take for the government, inheritance tax represents about 1% of the overall tax take. Clearly, income tax, corporation tax, VAT represents a much larger proportion of the overall tax haul. Whilst it represents a small part of the overall tax yield, it does have the capability of generating a high emotional response to it. And when you've got a strong emotional response to tax, which is largely negative, like why should I have paid tax all through my life and then my family, rather than I, have to pay tax on my death? With that emotional driver, there should be a greater openness to taking some action about it. And that certainly is what advisors have found amongst their proportion of clients for whom inheritance tax will be relevant. And as I said, a greater proportion of the clients of advisors will find that inheritance tax will be relevant to them and will want to do something about it. In the hierarchy of tax needs, once you get over age 60 and your priorities change and you start to think about what your family will be left and planning for them if you've looked after yourself well enough. A key part of the financial planner's objective to make sure that their clients are looked after well enough for themselves to then think about their families and their planning. So my view on inheritance tax planning is very much that to design and execute a plan that is practical, one needs to take an asset-based approach to inheritance tax planning. It's all very well talking about use the nil rate ban, use the annual exemptions, but the reality of being able to do something about it in practice will depend on the assets that you have. If your main asset that's giving rise to the liability is a residential property, then whilst you might well have been able to do something about it in the past, you probably won't these days, because the government have done quite a good job with the introduction of the now well-known gift reservation provisions and pre-owned assets tax provisions that largely prevent you giving something away and continuing to enjoy a benefit without paying for it. That isn't to say planning is utterly ruled out, but it's very difficult for most people. Now, we do have the transferable nil rate ban, and that's a good thing. Some of the provisions in relation to the new transferable nil rate ban, effectively the residential property nil rate ban, are resting in the finance bill, but that hasn't yet been enacted, but we do know, broadly speaking, that we have an additional amount of 175,000 eventually to use for residential property. So for families, though, where the residential property exceeds £1 million at best, and maybe less than that where they've got a cutback of that residence nil rate ban, then planning will be important. And what they can plan to do with their residential property is quite difficult. And their protection might be an answer. Life insurance in trust to meet the liability, very possibly funded for, at least partially, by the people who will benefit from it, the children. That might be something that's worth discussing with the family. Where you have other assets giving rise to the liability, particularly cash and investments, then there's a lot more that you can do that won't infringe gift reservation and pre-owned assets tax provisions. The many combinations of investment product and trusts leave us quite a wide range of solutions that might well be suitable for particular client types. Clients who are happy to give away but want a little control, who are happy to give away but need access to the original capital, loan trusts, are happy to give away but need a regular income, discounted gift trusts, and variations on those themes. All of those are tried and tested. None of those basic schemes give rise to the likelihood of any anti-avoidance provisions being applied to them. And we're also in the happy position of knowing that, at least based on the draft regulations, the last version that we saw, none of those will be subject to the new disclosure of tax avoidance schemes DOTAS expansion. So largely good news for inheritance tax planning for those with investments in cash, for those with residential property that gives rise to the liability above the nil rate band and the residential nil rate band. Then think about the role that protection in trust has to play. All of this is covered in, as you'd expect, quite a lot of detail in Techlink, both through the library documents and through the bulletins. I'd encourage you to keep up to date with that.